Okay, thanks everyone for coming, comedians and friends and puppeteers and a lot of people. Okay, we're all here today to celebrate the life of our brilliant friend, James Gavin Stott. And I never knew he was called James till last month, but there you go. Better known to most as Reg Anderson. I'm waiting. I wrote this assuming I wouldn't know some people, but I apparently know everyone here. So just say, I'm waiting. I'm here to do the opening eulogy. I've been his friend for almost 30 years, and I was with him till the last hours of his life in St Columba's Hospice. Because it was only a fortnight before, after months of pain, he was put in hospital for what he told me on the phone he thought was kidney stones. I went to visit him 2 days later after he had an MRI scan, and he told me, waiting, I'm going to die. I can't pay tribute enough to how bravely Reg, Gavin, or could just call him Reg, fuck it. Just go Reg to the news. That night I stayed with him for 5 hours after, and we chatted about God and the afterlife and other spiritual things. Then things got daft. We wrote a GoFundMe for him to go to Las Vegas and meet showgirls. Then he told me that he wanted to try ecstasy for the first time in his life. Why not? He tried every other fucking drug, you know. But then after an hour, his practical side kicked in. And he was making lists and phone calls and sorting out flat movements, and like it was any other day that would make, you know. I never knew he had that strength of character. It blew me away, because he was often a very physically frightened person. He once told me, oh man, I think everyone in this room is going to beat me up. And I went to him, this is an art house cinema. The hardest person in this room, my grandmother could knock the shite out of him. But in the last fortnight of his life, it was different. He was adult and accepting of his fate, while his friends were often falling apart. He had balls of steel. And saying that, I did ask Kim and Simon when we were arranging this, can I swear during this speech? And they said that was okay. So I have to tell those that I invited to this memorial, it was based on, and Colin can vouch for this, some instructions from Reg himself. Because you were all on what Reg called his no cunts list. Now, that doesn't mean, if you weren't on the list, that you're a cunt. It just means that if you were on the list, according to Reg, you're not. So give yourselves a round of applause for not being cunts. Yeah. I didn't think I'd have to deliver this in front of my dad, but there you go. This was never going to be a normal memorial service, was it? But if you don't say the very worst swear words at Reg Anderson Memorial, Reg would be appalled, and you're only seeing half the man, really, aren't you? But what he said in those final days that was stays with me was when he went, I don't fear death. I've had an amazing life. And he did. Even though he spent most of it with like 2 brass farthings to rub together. It was an incredible life. And when I tell you about it, you'll find it very, very easy to take the moral high ground. Whilst at the same time thinking, why is it my life 1/10 as fun and mental as that? As an older, one day he went to me, Leighton, did I ever tell you about the time I was a terrorist? But it's all right, because I was just trying to make people happy. And he told me the story, and he sort of was a terrorist. But he was just trying to make people happy. See, Reg, and his own description of himself as a kid, actually, can you bring up, oh yeah, that, yeah, it's up there, yeah, next one, thanks Simon. And his own description of himself as a kid was that of a little bastard. And in 1965, he got a job at Edward Thompson's factory printing bingo tickets 8 hours a day. Why did he ever leave Sunderland? So to cheer up his workmates, he thought he'd entertain them with a pastime that was apparently very popular amongst kids in Sunderland in that era, making a pipe bomb. considered a harmless variation on a fireworks display in mid-60s Sunderland, right? And it was long before Al-Qaeda or Northern Ireland and all that kind of business. So you plant a homemade pipe bomb in an empty field, light the touch paper, run, it would make a big explosion, everyone's happy. Unfortunately, the bomb this time was a little too successful. As not only did it make an enormous explosion, the shockwaves smashed all 200 windows in the New York Edinburgh tungsten factory. His punishment at the time was a small fine and being told off for being a nuisance. Right? He said if it was 10 years later, he'd have got life. Right? Then one day in Sunderland in 1968, he read chapter 1 of The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, which for some reason made him look around and go, in his own words, "Oh, there's more to life." Left Sunderland, tried his best not to come back. Went to London and got a job in an Oxo factory in 1969, where his fellow workmates nailed him by his work clothes to a table, under the belief that because he had long hair, he must love that Charles Manson. One of his greatest "did I ever tell you" bombshells was in the Royal Infirmary a month and a bit ago. He goes to me, "You know that Beatles rooftop concert thing that everyone's going on about just now? Did I tell you I was there?" No. Apparently it was a few streets away when he heard some loud music coming from somewhere. When word passed it was the Beatles, he rushed round to Apple Records headquarters, but a police cordon stopped him just getting into the street itself. So instead of not being able to see the Beatles in the street they were playing in, he couldn't see them from round the corner instead, but he could hear them though. And when we were watching a video of the Rolling Stones' famous concert in Hyde Park in 1969, a few years back, he pointed himself out in the audience, filming the audience. There's a clip there, it's the Eric Burdon one. Can you just play that?
It's coming. There we go.
Yeah, because it's a silence, sorry. So, there he is. There he is. Oh, Bill Jewers decided to stand up. That would be the person there. Oh yeah. Yeah, well, okay. Fuck off. So yeah, that was Eric Burdon of the Animals, House of the Rising Sun and all that. And yes, Reg was out his face in acid. Yes. Of course. So he was very much part of the 60s counterculture. He sold the hippy newspaper, IT, or the International Times, on street corners. He was then arrested and locked up by the Metropolitan Police for the night for doing so. Not having bothered to read that week's edition, Reg didn't realise the main story was called "How to Beat Up a Policeman." And it was apparently part of their "Fuck the Pigs" special. He was also part of the Piccadilly 144 squatters, but was forced out by several hundred Metropolitan bobbies, all filmed by Pathy News. So then he was forced to move back up north again. This time in Sunderland, he met David Bowie in the Locarno Ballroom lift. Fucking difficult to say that. With the Hype, which is Bowie's band at the time. It was kind of like a first go at the Spiders from Mars. "Hello, I'm Gavin." "Hello, I'm David," was the totality of their conversation. Before that long though, Gavin Stott, later Reg Anderson, became king of the Mackham hippies, the Timothy Leary of Sunderland. So here's some photos at the time. Yeah, this is a hippie cult den from 1971. It held particular sentimental value to Reg, that photo, because he told me it was because the day after that photo was taken, Reg took too much LSD, got arrested, and told the police all his mates were having an LSD party in their house. And the bobbies should go round and start dancing with them. The police pondered on this advice and instead went around, smashed the place up and arrested them. Reg said he was the most popular man in Sunderland after that. After escaping with another fine, he moved back down to London to become a Hare Krishna. Let me tell you the story of how he was thrown out to Hare Krishna. See, Hare Krishnas have their own version of the chastity belt. A piece of cloth wrapped very tightly around the crotch area to prevent sexual thoughts. One day, Reg was in Oxford Street in London, bashing his tambourine, going Hare Hare, etc. Just then, round the corner, armed with a BBC film crew, comes 70s pop star Lindsay DePaul. That's what Lindsay DePaul looks like. Reg is very quick to spot that Lindsay DePaul is not wearing a bra. A bra, I should say. Boy. The chastity belt is on the floor. Fellow Hare Krishnas are not amused. Reg moves back to fucking Sunderland. Starts the Working Men's Club band Mexico, which morphs into his later band Saltgrass. One of the members of which Reg fires, saying there's no room for musical deadbeats in this outfit. Said sack member then goes on to produce and write records for Status Quo, Jimmy Dale and Prefab Sprite. And is currently living in a mansion in Los Angeles. Reg later admits this may have been a mistake. Now here's the tricky part of the story. The late 70s, early 80s. Through fear of vengeance, a not totally unjustified fear, he kept quiet about this part of his life. But I can tell you now, in the late 70s, he moved to East Grinstead, below London, to become a Scientologist, where he stayed for 5 years, working 18 hours a day, building properties, being locked in at night, worshipping L. Ron Fuckwit, and trying to lie to himself that the novel Battlefield Earth was a great work of science fiction. One of the things he told me was the UK Scientologists did a secret deal with the Conservative Party when they were an opposition party in 1978 to get Scientology a much lower tax bill when the Tories got back into power. As their side of the deal, the Scientologists made every single one of their members in 1979, under threat of food rationing, walk down to the polling station and vote for Margaret Thatcher. Yes, Reg Anderson gave us neoliberalism. Fortunately, very fortunately, the Scientologists eventually threw him out for being an SP, a suppressive person. Apparently they weren't too happy with Reg going about saying he thought all this space alien stuff was a load of bollocks. Near the end of his time though, he started a short-lived musical collaboration with fellow Scientologist Woody Woodmansey, former drummer for David Bowie's Spiders from Mars. Unfortunately, this was 10 years after glam rock, and Woody Woodmansey was now running a painting and decorating business. But Woody had some old contacts in the music business, and he and Reg made a failed attempt to write for Dad's Army star Clive Dunn, hoping for a follow-up to his Grandad #1 hit. Woody used to get Reg told me Woody used to get upset at Reg getting confused and keeping on calling him Nutty Nosdensey. Back to fucking Sunderland. But then, in 1985, to Edinburgh, where he moved on the day of Live Aid in 1985, and this is where some of the people in this room started to come into the story. His beginnings in comedy start when he becomes friends with Paul Marshall, and they start the comedy duo, the McTonto Brothers. The area of creative conflict in that duo was that Paul was very much in favour of the idea of actually performing the scripted rap. Reg, less so. Something Reg would often only reveal to him once they were on stage. Then in 1988, Reg moved in with Kim and Simon, who organised the day. Give them a round of applause. He got roped into doing puppeteering for them. And that's the sanest thing I've said about his life so far. practically an accountancy course compared to the rest of it. So, the Edinburgh comedy scene, as we know it, Reg started. In 1992, he began the first ever alternative comedy club in Kingstables Road with a young Edinburgh University student named Mitch Benn. As we all know, Mitch went on to far greater heights when a couple of years later he became my brother's standing karaoke presenter in Toll Cross. True. Then other local acts around the scene: Bill Dewar, Viv G, Gordon Brunton, future flatmate Joe Heenan. This was when Gavin Stott became Reg Anderson, but he would occasionally also be Barry Dagenham, and my favourite, Ken Mollett. The first time I ever saw Reg was in the Dallas and Packer Club in the Grass Market in Edinburgh in 1994. A performance that was both the funniest and least professional thing I've ever seen in my life. He had always props in a plastic bag in those days. Other lesser acts would have prepared the many props in perhaps the order that were meant to come in the bag. Reg instead had always props that were meant to come out first at the bottom. He desperately searched around the bag, got angry at the bag, told the bag to go and fuck itself, stamped on the bag, eventually pulled out a Linda Blair the Exorcist doll, spun her head, said "Your mother sucks cocks in hell pit," and went off to the best applause of the night. So Bill Dewar and Colin Simpson are going to go into his comedy career in more detail later, so I'll let them fill you in about his comedy career more, but I'll just to say that I remember it was in clubs like the Music Box in Dallas and Parker when Reg thrived, because it came from a more sort of experimental comedy tradition of Spike Milligan and Monty Python, where if some of it doesn't work, who cares because the highs are higher. That was the philosophy. So exactly the time was very much a mixture of like dad jokes and mad jokes and swearing puppets and talking about getting a Vegas residency. You know, he fitted in perfectly. Then comedy's priorities changed. You know, comedy became about slickness and doing a tight 20 minutes and buying comedy club owners a big house. You know? This didn't suit Reg anywhere near as much, so he started his own comedy nights, which were the maddest, insane and occasionally scariest nights in Scottish comedy history. I sometimes had comedians criticise Reg on the grounds that, you know, he wasn't consistent or tight as they were, and I'd respond, well, I'd want to respond, I'm too polite, but I'd want to respond, unlike Reg, you're not the greatest storyteller I've ever met in my life. Reg is. You're not the most naturally funny person I've ever met in my life. Reg is. Well done, you found a sellable format for your mediocrity. He didn't find one for his genius. I remember in Agriman's Buzz Club in Manchester about 20 years back, Johnny Vegas clutching my arm in hysterics. He was laughing so much at Reggie's mind-stroke illusion horror routine. John Lennon once talked about how the problem with making a living performing is, in order to survive, you've got to perfect performing in front of exactly the type of people you hated at school. Right? And we've all got to compromise with that to some extent, you know? But that doesn't mean if you perfect that, that's the only benchmark. That an act that's too weird or experimental or batshit or inconsistent for Darren and Sharon fuckwit genres is your artistic inferior. In fact, as everyone from Spike Milligan to Vic and Bob and yes, Reg Anderson have shown, these acts are often the best. So I'm not going to give any qualified praise of Reg Anderson at all. He was my favourite act in comedy. I may have seen his act going into the 1,000 times. A total original, whose very being was a work of art. He needs to bow his head to fucking nobody in comedy. Even when he was a pain in the arse, he was more interesting than almost everyone else at the top of their charisma. And as for Gavin Stott, he was my best friend for 30 years, and life is going to be infinitely more boring without him. I'll end by saying, Gavin, Reg, you were a life force. I will never forget you, and I miss you terribly. Thank you. honestly, I was just skimming the surface of the mad shit he's told me. All the stuff. I mean, I never even got to when he almost got into a fist fight with the Duke of Edinburgh. That happened, right?